Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Patient First podcast. I'm very excited today. We have a great mind with us today. Dino Watt, who is one of the most exciting business trainers and the author of #1 best-selling books, The Practice RX and Hire and Fire Like a Boss. He's been featured on many places like ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox News, and TEDx. As a high-performance practice advisor, Dino frequently has been referred to as the Tony Robbins of private practices. His goal is to help business leaders and teams create more passion in their life, be more productive in the office, and create more profit in all areas of their life. Dino, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
I'm thrilled to be here, Bryan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of like-minded in that I think culture and the kind of like, I guess really the culture of your practice is vitally important. And I think that it's in dentistry, culture is misunderstood and not enough people know how to focus on that. And so I'm excited to talk with you about that. But first, I'd like to hear, how did you actually get into this dental industry anyway? As a dentist, we're kind of here. It's kind of comes with the territory, but you're not a dentist. So tell me about your journey.
Yeah. So if you would have told me, 15 years ago that I was going to be in this industry, I would have been like, why was that the industry? So my original business was around higher-end entrepreneurs and helping them in their marriage, helping them have better relationships inside of their marriage so they can be better bosses in the office. I had a client out here in Utah who was a financial advisor who I had worked with. And in a lot of his clients actually ended up being dentists. One in particular hired me to come out to his office and see his team, because as I was working with him and his wife in their marriage, he went, Dino, this is great. This is awesome. My wife and I are getting along awesome. But I'm married to 6 other work wives in my office, and they all have different personalities and communication styles. Can you help me? Well, I've been a student of business for years. I've been an entrepreneur for over 20 years. And so I came in and I was like, sure. And I went in and I started to see things. I didn't know at that time that out of all the schooling and education you get almost no education on how to run a business. And I was looking at things going, well, why are you doing it like this? Why don't you do it like this and changing things? He's like, no one's telling me how to do this stuff. Why don't you show me how to do more? And then that rolled into a couple more dentists and then more orthodontists. And just was one of those things where I saw a big need and a big hole and just kind of jumped right in.
Like a lot of good answers, there's a lot to deconstruct there. So, man, I've got like 12 questions based on just your answer. So, #1, you said your previous business was helping people in their marriages so they could be better leaders at work.
Yeah.
That alone, to me, is an interesting concept that I need to know more about. So, what about having a better relationship with your spouse makes you a better leader at work?
Yeah. So I realized early on, I've always loved marriage and relationships. I was definitely the friend zone dude in high school, right? Because I gave great advice and great information to the girls, but I was the likable guy, right? Not the dateable guy. And so
I was both unlikable and undateable. That's a whole nother.
At least I got 1 out of 2. That's
right.
So I had always had this idea. And like I said, I'm a student of business. And I started looking at some of my friends who were having a hard time, guy friends who having a hard time talking about their relationship, because it was usually around feelings and what's wrong with me and all stuff. And so I started to relate their business to their marriage. And so I created a process called the business of marriage. And what I noticed real early on was, especially for men, and now I have probably about half and half female to men clients, but especially for men, this idea of bandwidth in your head. If you are someone who is, for example, stressed out in your marriage, it's not going well. I don't know how frank I can be on this podcast, but yeah, you haven't had sex in a couple of weeks. It's on the top of your brain. And you're now trying to go into work and be a focused, centered, high performance person. And that's almost impossible to do. You cannot be running at full speed when you've got all these other concerns personally, which is why a lot of people get so stressed out and frustrated that they choose to lose one of them. Well, they're not going to lose the business, so they lose their marriage. And in the end, in our industry, in the dental industry, when I started doing more research around the effects of business on the psyche and the stress and the frustration of doctors, you know, as well as I do, one of the highest suicide rates in any industry is dentistry. And I started looking at that, going like, why is that? Why can't we figure that out? And I believe a lot of it has to do with this trying to stretch and balance this work life thing and not having anybody to actually help them out with that. So I created the business of marriage. A lot of guys were willing to talk about it because it was talking about business and, oh, okay, well, if you do this in your business, why don't we do this in your marriage? Kind of similar. So you're not thinking about it as feelings and getting on a couch and talking about what's wrong with you. Instead, let's put systems in place that help you get the results you want. And it became pretty successful.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it's great perspective. Thanks. I think personally, I have a great marriage mainly because of my wife.
Yeah.
So I but yeah, I think
Because you chose right, it chose
I chose
correctly,
life.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Like I
That's
was
why I always tell her, I'm like, I chose you. I made a good choice.
right, right.
I mean,
And you get
I
it.
can't
Like
really
I
speak.
if you're like me, you get it. You're like, I know I married up, right? I get it. I
Yeah.
thank you. Like, thank you for saying yes. I was on a podcast years ago, a dental podcast that will go unnamed. But as we're talking about it, like literally in the middle of the interview, the guy goes, well, Dino, don't you think that most reasons why dentists divorce is because they marry gold diggers? And I went, oh my gosh, well, I hope not. Like, I'm sorry, that's your perspective. And this is obviously a guy who's had 2 or 3 divorces. So yeah,
Yeah. Wow. Man, we could talk about that for hours.
yeah.
But the next thing that I wanted to more highlight on than ask you about, because and I'd like you to go into more depth,
Yeah,
is about this reality that dentists don't have a lot of training in about running a business in dental school.
yeah.
Because my era, I graduated 20 years ago, a generous 20 years, a couple more than 20 now. But in my era, that was true and it was wrong, right?
Yeah,
It was because 95% of dental practices were going to run a business. Today, it's still true. I don't even know if it's wrong because there's more to learn clinically. And let's face it, you can come out and have a great career and never really be business owner. However, I think, I believe that when you say about business training in dental school, the piece that I see missing drastically is leadership training
yep,
because as a dentist, by role of your title, your job, even if your role is to be just doing clinical dentistry, unless you're going to be by yourself doing that, and even if you are by yourself, you have to lead the patient somewhere, right?
yep.
And so I like to think of today. I agree with you on the business training, but more specifically, I believe it's leadership training that's a massive void in the world, but in dentistry, it's kind of red hot, crucially needed. Do you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I think it's actually, I think we're saying the same thing because business, understanding business, the first thing you have to do is understand leadership. And great business owners are great leaders. And so, absolutely, if they can learn how to communicate and connect, if they can learn how to give direction, if they can learn how to delegate. You mentioned something that I think is a misnomer in our industry, which I don't think you become great business owners. You become great business operators, maybe, but there's a huge difference between being an operator and an owner. And if you can learn how to be a great leader, then you can become a great owner of a practice.
That makes a lot of sense. The dynamics of dentistry, I believe, are changing quickly, meaning what it takes to own a successful practice, to
Yeah,
lead a successful practice. And so while maybe you don't need to necessarily be that much as good with financials as previously, or you don't need to
sure,
be as strong in marketing that somebody else can handle that.
sure.
But I think that the way dentistry is changing, really the great dentists of the future are going to be great leaders, like you're
Yep,
saying,
yep.
because you're going to have larger organizations, more turnover of team members, and that
Yep.
that kind of thing. Do you agree with that too?
Yeah, and you're coming from a transformation, right? When you look at the history of dentistry, you know this better than I do. Even that there was a time not too long ago where how dare you put an ad in the yellow pages, right? The market you're talking about marketing, right? How dare you promote yourself out there? Because the work should just speak for itself. You shouldn't have to do that. And that is definitely a thinking, dinosaur thinking. That does not work nowadays. And the ability to have, as you said, other people who can do those pieces for you is really crucial. And that's being a great leader, is knowing this, the places where you're strength at, great. Places that you're not, great. Have somebody else do that. And you can hire those out now.
Yeah, and I think it's important. This is one of the things that I have a course called the Insanely Productive Dentist where we talk a lot about leadership
Mhm.
training, and I think that what people think of leadership, oftentimes they're really talking about managing, right?
Yes.
And so I have sort of my thoughts and thinkings about the differences between leadership and management.
Yep.
So I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Well, to the point of kind of what I do now is I've really transformed a lot of what I do into this idea around culture, as you're mentioning earlier. I think if you have the right culture, or the right leader, I should say, then you create the right culture. And a magnetic culture is something that has to start with the great leader. You look at companies like Apple or Disney, even though those two gentlemen are no longer with us, the vision and the leadership that they had is still moving a company forward because of it. And when it missteps, when it's outside of that vision and that leadership that was put in place, everybody feels it. Disney is a great example right now because of some of the things, whether you agree with it or not, socially that they're doing. There's a disconnect between the vision of what Walt Disney put out there to what's happening now, and people are feeling the bite of that. So yeah, I absolutely think that you have to start with that leadership, and then owner being a business owner, understanding the financial stuff, that's all secondary.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that what leadership is and its value is missed businesses across the world, including
Absolutely.
dentistry. And you brought up Apple versus Disney, and I agree. I mean, Steve Jobs had that, well, obviously,
Mhm.
arguably created one of the best cultures of our time, right?
Right.
In Apple, he left, and the company almost tanked, right? So then
Yep.
you bring him back in, and the reason why Apple's still successful today is I think that Apple and Steve Jobs learned from that mistake, and
Mhm.
they put in that magnetic culture that is allowing it to continue. Whereas Disney hasn't had made that misstep to learn from, and
Yep.
they quite possibly, like you're saying, is doing it now.
Yeah.
So I couldn't be in more agreement with you. But so what is the magnetic culture that you talk?
So if you think about companies like that, I mean, they really have superseded a lot of the problems that are out there in the world. So when you have a company like an Apple or a Disney or any other company that is magnetic, meaning totally overcomes price, right? They're the highest price. Both of those companies, highest price product out there. You can get a laptop from a PC at Best Buy for $300, or you go to Apple and you're getting the same basically thing. It can still go on the internet. You can still go to Word. You can still get to your Google Docs. You do everything you do, unless you're a graphic designer or an editor of pictures. You don't really need all of that, but they've created a product that they can charge minimum. I just bought one; it's $2,500, but you can get one for $1,000, as cheap as one you can get. Disney, highest ticket prices in any amusement park out there. It's because they overcome price, they overcome location. Everybody, Disney being the number one vacation spot in the world, Orlando, I should say. They overcome economy, government, competition. So if you look at all these companies that do this, and you can go to different companies like that, you could do this negatively too, where you look at companies like Juul cigarettes, e-cigarettes. They've overcome all those things too, because they have a certain, not just brand, but culture around them. And we can do that in our practices as well. You just need the three main things, which are having a real specific vision. Everybody knows what Disney's vision is: happiest place on earth. It's relatable, it's retellable. We can tell our friends about it. Everybody wants to go there. Who doesn't want to have them go to the happiest place on earth? Even if you don't like Disney, you have in life, you want to be at the happiest place on earth. Then you have, after your vision, you have your expectations, meaning you know exactly who you are and what you're doing to get to that vision. And it has to be totally make sense. People who say, oh, my vision or my expectations, which a lot of people will call core values. Our core value is honesty. Well, what's the alternative? Why is that a core? That's not a core value. That's the cost of doing business, right? You can't use that. But Disney, for example, creates Make It a Magical Day. Nordstrom's creates that will return anything policy, right? Those are core values that they have. And then the last thing is support. How do you support the group of people that are around you, that are working for you, to spread the message of your thing? When you do that, and those three things, you create this magnetic culture that attracts the right people and rejects the wrong people. And that's really important, because you don't want the wrong people in your business, but the in the right culture will reject them, and it attracts the right patients in our case, or customers to work with. And it's really important, because every office, every company has a culture. It's not whether you have one or not. It's whether you understand how to create it. And if you're not creating it and specifically design it, it's actually run by the highest energy in the office. So if your highest energy is a negative energy, if it's Susie, who is just a bully to everybody else in the office, but you don't want to, you're not a great leader, as you mentioned earlier. So you don't want to have to deal with it. So you just let Susie keep running stuff. Susie has usually zero financial interest other than her paycheck in the success of your business. But Susie's running your practice and she's running your culture. And that's the culture you get, because you're not specifically designing it. And that will never be a magnetic culture.
Yeah, I hope everybody rewinds a couple minutes and listens to that last.
Sorry, spoke
I
pretty
could
fast.
no, I want to interrupt you with a question, because I could not have been more in agreement along that entire discussion about magnetic culture, and I think it is massively valuable to everybody listening. And I often say that the average dental practice, I could probably produce 10% more just by going in and firing the right person.
Oh, for sure.
Right?
Oh,
Because
for sure.
because what you described is pervasive in dentistry. The
I,
negative energy that's taking over the culture of the practice, and in the void of leadership, that's what's going to happen. Right?
Yeah, I have a saying that I use all the time, and people, and we were just at the American Association of Orthodontics general meeting, and I had it on a big backdrop, just a quote, and it is, nothing will ruin your practice faster. Sorry, nothing will ruin a good employee faster than watching you tolerate a bad one. And people would stop and take pictures of that thing. And I have it in my second book, Hire and Fire Like a Boss, because it's just a truth. You let people get away with stuff, they watch that. Jim Collins talks about this in Good to Great, right? If you have a bunch of A-list players, A players, you bring in a C player, everybody drops to a B.
Yeah, and I want to point out here that what you're describing, like a lot of strong principles, easy in concept and very, very difficult in practice.
Yeah.
And so if you're sitting here listening to this going, oh my gosh, I should have gotten rid of Bob 3 years ago, welcome to planet Earth. I've been there. I'll continue to be there all the time. That's the way it works.
Yep.
So don't beat yourself up over it. Just
create a plan.
Take action on it, right?
Yeah.
Because that's where I think people get stuck. They get stuck in that place of like,
Totally.
oh my gosh, it's not that bad because I didn't deal with it for the last 10 years. Do you agree?
Yeah. I definitely don't want people, and I talk about this all the time, I hate it when people start shooting all over themselves, right? Like, I should be like this, I should do that, I should do this. And it's like, yeah, like, we're all humans. It's about learning. And I walk in offices all the time. I never go into an office and tell the doctor they need to fire somebody. I have no idea what's going on there. I don't know if they got pictures that the doctor doesn't want released on the internet, right? I have no idea. What I will do is I'll question the doctor. I'm like, why are you okay with that? What is it that this person brings that I'm not seeing that you're okay with keeping that person? Now, I do have a general rule for the doctors that if that doctor walks in the morning and he sees, let's just say, Sally again, and Sally walks by him and she says, "Good morning, doctor." And the doctor says, "Oh, good morning, Sally." But in his brain or her brain, she thinks, "I wish you would quit." That's the cue for you to either get something straight with them. You need to give them the opportunity to know that what they're doing is not okay, or that they're not up to standards, or you're out of integrity and you need to love them into another job. But yeah, I mean, be willing to learn so you can do better, not beat yourself up because you're hearing this, or you read a book, or you listen to one of your colleagues who's supposedly doing amazing, and start thinking how sucky you are.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. Now, I want to take a little bit of a left turn because you've been sort of talking about an issue that's pervasive in dentistry that I don't know a lot about, other than I've hear stories and it's happened in my practice. And there's all sorts of there's a lot of weird interpersonal stuff that happens in dentistry. Like you said, like this dentist doesn't want to fire that person because they might put stuff on the internet. And
Yeah.
I've heard that one of the ways like to tell if there's embezzlement is if there's a hot tub in the practice and all this like weird stuff happens in
Up
dentistry.
in
I
the
mean,
practice. What?
yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of weird stuff like that people
Yeah.
do with their teams and that happens between team members and stuff. And I mean, I guess that's human nature a bit, but why? I
Sure.
don't think, do other businesses have as much of this stuff, or is this heightened in dentistry?
I think other businesses do. It really depends on how close people have to work to one another. We have this weird thing in our industry. I guess it's not just our industry. And what I was about to say was the front and back thing, right? I call it the Jets and the Sharks, right? You've got this. The front doesn't understand what the back's doing. The back doesn't understand what the front's doing. So there's always this war between the two. But actually, in the restaurant industry, it's the same way, right? You've got the kitchen complains about the serving staff. The serving staff complains about the kitchen being too slow, vice versa. So we all have it. It's this interesting thing. I have a full training that I do around perspective, that really people don't have perspective. You have perspective of, all right, I'm not living in Africa having to walk, 5 hours a day to get water for my family. Okay, that's a perspective. But we also don't have this perspective, though, in our offices of just because you see something one way, and just because maybe you trained Sally how to do something one way, and just because you've worked together for the last 10, 20 years, just because you grew up in the same town, just because you're the same religion, all those just because does not mean that in this particular moment, Sally's going to see things the same way you do. And until we start understanding that about one another and understanding that everything that happened in Sally's life that morning up until that day changes her perspective in the way that she sees stuff, and you too. And that's where I think some of the biggest challenges come up with most doctors and team members is not really being willing to sit back and have a different perspective. I have a saying that I use, which is, are you being more inquisitive or are you being more accusational in this conversation? Are you making statements that you believe are just true because you believe it? Or are you asking questions to find out, why did they do that? Why did they think this was the right way to do that? When we can do that, we get along a lot better because we have different perspective on each other's lives.
I want to ask you two related questions because in my brain, I'm making some assumptions that I want to see if it's true or not. The average practice that comes to see you, that reads your books, that hires you for training or goes to hear you speak on the spectrum, nobody's perfect, right? There's
Yeah.
Apple and Disney that are
And they
here on
still
your
got
genetic
problems.
culture
Yeah,
too,
absolutely. Yeah.
right? And then there's people that everybody's fighting and sleeping with each other at the same time and doing
Yeah.
all sorts of craziness that happens in dentistry, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the people in the middle. So
Yeah.
on the spectrum of great culture, good culture, horrible culture,
Mhm.
what's your average people that you work with, and who would you ideally work with?
My average people I work with are actually more towards the great culture spectrum of that. I will get people who call me on the desperation level of like everybody hates each other, this type of thing. But they're typically not. When you think about it in dentistry, orthodontics, either way, about 20% of all practices engage in some sort of coaching or consulting in general. So that's 80% of people who don't. So people who come to me are either really way far gone, and it's actually, for me, honestly, I usually send them to resources. I want to see how coachable they are. I don't like to take on a lot of people like that because I don't like to work harder than I have to. Right? It's like it's if after 20 years this is where you are, why now? What do you what's and maybe it's because you're just that fed up and you're really ready to make a change. And I have certain ways to figure that out if you really are coachable. But for the most part, the offices that come to and are attracted to me are the ones that are really like, if you're on a scale of 1 to 10, and 10 being that perfect Disney or the good Disney culture, not perfect, they're going to be probably around a 7 or an 8. And my job is to find out what do they need to do to get up to that 10 in their mind. And the cool thing about it is usually they've done a lot of the legwork on their own. They've been trying to figure it out, and they just need 1 or 2 or 3 tweaks. and some accountability to get them there. And that's fun because they're already in the mindset, they're just stuck. Now, I will say that the ones that are about a 5 or a 4, I like working with them too, because usually it's the people who are really, you're going to see the biggest shift. And it's a quick shift, right? If you, it's not easy, like you said earlier, and that's don't be fooled. It's not easy, but when you do the things, you put yourself in. I'll give you an example. My very first ortho client, within 6 months of our coaching, he had a 90% turnover in his team. Like that freaked him out, as you can imagine. 90% of the people that were there when we started had left because he finally put his foot down, said, "This is my vision of my practice. I'm not going to let you change it. I'm not going to let you tell me no." And people didn't like that they couldn't bully him anymore. But the benefit was he got all these new people who were attracted to this new vision. He's happier. He's not burned out. He's a better father. He's a better husband. He's a better leader. He's thrilled. And to this day, that practice is thriving. It's so important. But yeah, I'm more in that range of the 7 or 8s. I love those people.
That's what I was thinking, because I think a lot of people listening today might be in that 7 or 8 or 4 or 5 or 6.
If they're
And they
listening to a
think that,
podcast,
well,
most likely.
what's that?
If they're listening to a podcast, most likely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But they might think that this is for the 1s or the 2s, and it's absolutely not. I
Nope.
mean, this is, like you just stated right now. I mean, there's this massive turnover in employees everywhere, and definitely in dentistry.
Yep.
And so this is a great time. So probably the best, well, certainly the best time since I've been practicing to work on culture.
Yep.
Because one of my favorite quotes is by the music producer Rick Rubin, who says the best art divides the audience, right?
Yes.
And so you have to, if you don't know what you stand for, you figure out what you stand against, right?
Yeah.
And creating that magnetic culture right now is absolutely key. And it's difficult if you have to do it by yourself. If you're already have a practice that's been turning for a while, it's much better to work with somebody or have a resource like your books that can guide you through the process so that everybody collectively owns it, right? That's my pitch for people to work with Dino Watt.
I appreciate it. That's very, very kind of you. It's true. And it's even the people in your practice, right? Yep. Getting the right butts in the seats helps you create that culture a lot faster. And boy, you will find out very quickly once you start saying, "This is what I am, who I am, this is what I stand for," it'll completely shift.
Well, like I said before, there's a big leadership void in dentistry, and it's really, when I think about leadership void, it's exactly what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Having a vision that other people can rally around, so that we can, because that's how you do great things. And so, thank you for what you're doing for the industry.
Thank you very much for having me. This is fun. I'm glad.
Sure.
So glad to be here.
How can people get a hold of you, read your books?
Yeah, dinowatt.com. It's DINOWATT, no S.com's there. All my books are on Amazon. If you're doing anything virtual, my newest book came out in August of last year called Mastering Virtual Consults or Selling Through the Screen. There's 2 books there. Yeah, reach out. Love to talk to you, see if there's anything I can do to help.
Awesome. Dino, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryan. Appreciate it.